Hello, and thank you for listening to Critical Thinking is Required. You're about to listen to our part 5 of the Critical Thinking is Required Literature Series 1. So this is our first series, our first book, and it's For a New Liberty by Murray Rothbard. And today we're going to be doing part 5, which is chapters 10 through 12. We have one more part, which will be coming out probably tomorrow or sometime early next week. And as always, you can make sure to check out criticalthinkingIsRequired.com to see these other parts if you want to learn more, or the YouTube page. So just to remind everyone, because I think this is really big to put this book into context, but Murray Rothbard wrote this book in 1973. So this is over 40 years ago, and most of this stuff applies today. The last part, part 6, I think is going to be really important in trying to just see the similarities of 40 years ago to today. So today, let's first turn to chapter 10, and that's government and business. It's basically what government does, whether we need government doing business type of things. So the question we always hear is, well, don't we need the state? Like, we need it, right? And so, I mean, how else will people be able to mail things? If I want to send a letter to someone who lives in a rural area, I mean, how the heck am I going to be able to do that? How am I going to be able to get water? How am I going to be able to if my house is on fire? Who's going to save me if the government won't be there? Who's going to protect us from invasion and from terrorists? Well, we need the state to protect us. That's what we hear, right? How else will that happen? Well, the good question, I think, Murray Rothbard points out, this is important, is, well, how does anything, like, how do we pay for anything? Why don't we need the state in those other things? Like, why do we distinguish these certain things that we need the state? We need the state to build roads for some reason, but we don't need it to sell us food. I mean, that seems a bit off. We don't need them to sell us homes and provide shelter to everyone. It doesn't make sense. Those are the most important things. The Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You need to have food. You need to have shelter. You need to have clothing, water, basic stuff, right? But we can get all that stuff on the market. It's quite magical. And so, unfortunately, one of the things that happens because of government, so when government, so we do ask for government to intervene in these things. So even if let's say we're minarchists and we believe in limited government, however you define that, even if it's just police and defense, it could be other stuff as well. It just depends on how you define it. But even then, the inherent problem of the state, and we've talked about this before, I think, too, is that when it's government, right? And it doesn't allow competition in these things, so it provides monopoly of services. And progressives hate monopoly of companies, right? And it's for the same reasons that libertarians dislike monopoly of government. It's the same type. There can be no differences between the two. Monopolies are generally bad, at least if it's not natural, because you can have competition and then it can eventually go out of business. But here we have the problem of monopoly generally is that its choices are going to be coercively imposed on all. Now, this is even different between a business monopoly where it's voluntary. So at least it's voluntary. There's no coercion. There's no violence that can occur as a reaction. But with government, there is. Okay, they can make these little magical choices, and they have to, because that's the way the state is made. It has to have bureaucracy. There's no way around it. Even as I'm learning more about socialism, progressivism, anarcho-syndicalism, if that's what it's called, all this stuff requires bureaucracies. And what that does is these people, the ruling class, because there has to be someone in charge, even if it's just like a common everyday person, there's still going to be a ruling class. And they're going to make choices that are going to be coercively imposed on everybody. And they have to deal with it, even the minorities. And what that's going to do is it's going to lead to conflict. That is inherent. So you're going to have battles. You're going to have divisions. You're going to have conflicts. You're going to say, oh, the abortion clinic, you shouldn't be able to protest within 30 feet. Well, no, 45 feet. No, 37 feet. Or, there's going to be all these things that people are going to conflict about that are so silly, because they shouldn't have to. It should be that if the private market was doing it, you wouldn't have to worry about these conflicts. I mean, you can just turn on the news, and how many times do you hear a conflict with the private market? I mean, the only time I hear is with something maybe GMO or something like that. But, the interesting thing about that is companies are taking GMO out of their product. I recently heard not only are a lot of restaurants doing it, but like Cheerios and some companies, they don't even advertise it because they don't want people to know for some reason, which is kind of weird, but they're taking it out. And so they're listening to us, right? But regardless, you have conflict all the time when it comes to government. It's inherent. And if consumers purchase goods or services they demand, there are no battles, remember? So if you're the minority who's screwed when it comes to government, because it's a majority over minority, regardless of what one thinks. I mean, even if it's on a local level and it's the workers unite, well, it's still a majority of workers who are there's going to be some people who are ticked off. But when it's in the private market, those people who are ticked off, the people who are sidelined, who are coerced to have this imposition of the rule and law, well, they can just buy another product. They don't have to accept that. So then there's a service and payment thing, and I think this is really the biggest thing. This, to me, this is one of the reasons that I can't really support socialism, or at least in its fullest definition, right, of how von Mises would define it, or progressivism, or the idea of government bureaucracy being able to understand service and payment. And that's the problem here. It's the price mechanism. There's no price mechanism when it comes to government. Inherent in all government operation is a grave and fatal split between service and payment. It is inherent. There's a ruling class, a bureaucracy. They have to pass laws. They have to pass regulations. They have to pass notes and like memorandums so that people will understand what the law is going to be. But what happens is those are people. Those are human beings just like you and me who have to make these decisions, and that's going to be coerced upon everyone, even the minority who doesn't want to live with that, whether good or bad, right? And the private firm, well, they get their money from serving the consumer. So they can just they have to be prepared to meet the needs of the consumer. If the needs of the consumer are not met, then that consumer is going to go somewhere else. But the state, they don't have to worry about that. There's no price mechanism. What? Oh, we could, you know, it's, oh yes, I apologize. It's a democracy, right? So all you have to do is just go to the ballot and just vote. But even then, even if you assume that that's true, that's still 51% telling the 49% what to do, even though that's not even true because the turnout is so horrible. And so basically, you know, the state can treat the consumer however it wants. And one of the examples that Murray Rothbard talked about was at that time in the 70s, there was a New York City water shortage. I guess he lived in that area or whatever. But and this was an interesting point, is that when that happens, and you can see it today even in California with the water shortage, the drought and everything, all these type of same situations, is the government, what they do is they tell the consumer to drink less water. That's what they tell them to do. They say, you need to put it on your, remember Jimmy Carter too when he ran, you need to do this. But does a private business ever do that? I can't think of it. Does Comcast tell me I need to stop watching too many Netflix shows because it's you know, I'm using too much information on their server? I'm causing a data conflict there or whatever? I'm using too much bandwidth? No, they don't do that. If anything, what they would probably do if net neutrality wasn't there, if they didn't have to worry about all that stuff, is they'd probably charge me more because I'm using more than maybe everyone else is, right? And that's what they would do. They wouldn't tell me to consume less. And that acts as a price mechanism. And that acts as a way to conservation, which I don't know if we talk about in this one, but we'll talk about that too, and how that acts as a way to protect the environment, interestingly enough. So this profit and loss mechanism, that's the price mechanism. Well, in the private market, if they're successful, they obtain capital for expansion. If they're not successful, so if they're not making profit, if they're not listening to consumers, they're not selling consumers what they want and need, they're going to go out of business. If they're not happy, the consumers aren't happy, they're going to go out of business. They can't just do whatever they want to do. I mean, what business does that? You know, even though the evil Walmart and even the evil Comcast doesn't necessarily do that. Of course, we could talk about how government creates those type of company, those large corporations. But even then, it's not like Comcast is truly treating us like garbage, okay? Their customer service might be, but our service is pretty damn good. So I'm not going to complain. I've had worse service, let's just say, with other companies, even though I really dislike Comcast. And so again, if they're successful, they get more money, they make profit, and they can use it to expand. Well, government, they don't have to worry about that. They don't have to worry about capital for expansion. They especially don't have to worry about going out of business. I mean, when's the last time a government has gone out of business in the United States? Oh, is it 1791, it's been a long, 1776, right? It's been a long time. And it's not going to happen anytime soon. And they don't have to worry about capital because they just tax us. They steal it. It's that easy. And so the idea of a progressive is going to come by, and I think this is a reasonable and decent argument, is that, well, hey, yeah, maybe this is true, but maybe there's a way to run government as a business. Let's do it efficiently. There has to be a way to do price mechanism. There's a way we can see this. Maybe if we elect the right people. Now, that's always problematic, but let's put that one aside. Let's try to run it efficiently like a business. Well, the problem is the inherency of the state. It is the main aggressor. It's always a monopoly. There's no competition, right? There's no one that can compete. The state doesn't say, oh, we'll let you have another state within the state. Like, they would lose power. They need that monopoly, that monopolization of violence. They need that. And so an example is the post office. And what happens, although things have changed since 1973 because we have FedEx and UPS, so they did allow competition, which is interesting, which is one of their downfalls. That's why they're losing $4 billion a quarter and why they need multiple funds and bailouts from government and loans from us, really. And so what happened at that time, and even today, is, well, the post office, it's far more costly, it's higher priced, and it's poor quality. And they don't have to worry about cutting costs. That's the thing. You can't run it as a business because they don't have to worry about, they can give out pensions. They can give out pensions and they don't have to worry about it. So, think about your city. I'm sure your city, just like my city and just like every city, has a problem with pensions, maybe with police or city workers. That's because they don't have to worry about that stuff. They can just offer it to everybody because they have to, probably through the law. And so they don't have to worry. They can just raise taxes and pay for it. A private market, they cannot do that. Okay? They can't gain capital through some violence. They just can't do that. And the free market establishes prices which permit the private firms to calculate the costs. So we've talked about that in the last episode. And again, the private business gains profit by cutting costs as much as it can. So it's always going to be efficient, which interestingly enough, when you talk about efficiency, is it's not only for profit, but it's for the environment. I always look at it that way too. Whenever you talk about efficiency, it's generally good for the environment because you're making things cleaner. You're making it easier. You're taking out the waste resources that aren't required. So what's the solution? What's Murray Rothbard's solution to this problem? Well, basically the abolition of the public sector. You would just get rid of everything that the government does in a business type related job. That would be police, fire, post office, FDA, all this stuff. And instead it would be performed by the private enterprise economy. And again, like he said, the private market does pretty much everything else. Think about all the stuff it does. Think about it creates these things that we drive on a road that if it fell apart, we could die, or that if we got in an accident, we could die. And they somehow protect they make these things that can protect us when we get hit. Like, it's magical. It's beautiful. It's magical how that happens. And that's the private market, and it can do it more than just that example. So chapter 7, Murray Rothbard talks about streets and roads. And I have a picture here on YouTube, and you can just see this road. I don't know what the private market roads would look like, but it's just chaotic. What we have today. So what would be the result of the abolition of public sector? So if you got rid of the public sector and pretty much everything, what would happen? Well, then all pieces of land and all the land areas would be owned privately by individuals or groups. You would have that basic tenet of homesteading. You'd be able to own the property that you'd have because you have possession, right? Now, of course, you wouldn't be able to own 1,000 acres if there's a bunch of other people around, because you're not going to be able to homestead that land. You're not going to be able to protect it from other people. There's no way you're going to be able to claim that. And what this does is this private ownership of land and the areas within the land is it solves numerous problems. And it goes back to the abortion clinic thing. Let's say you can hear it in Texas, and they keep making all these laws where the protesters have to be a certain feet away and all this stuff. Well, they're on public land, right, is my understanding. And that's why they're allowed to protest. They're on sidewalks or something like that. Well, let's say you were an abortion clinic and you wanted to avoid that. Well, then all you would do is buy a bigger parcel of land, put your building in the middle of it, and have a long walkway. And so that's all private. So nobody would be allowed on that unless they were invited and they follow the rules of being invited, right? And so everyone else would be a trespasser, and then you could get rid of them however the market would work, right? And so that solves that problem. So we don't even have to talk about it anymore because it's being solved. But then the question is, well, we need police, right? This is the minarchism argument. We have to have police, right? They're just this special agency. Now, of course, in Ferguson and other events, we might question police. Even in our own communities, we might question how successful and how efficient they are, especially compared to the cost. But the question here is like, what say if we didn't have police? Let's just pretend for a moment. Well, if crime was increased and just chaos and crazy in a particular area, what would happen? What do you think would happen? Well, the customers would stop going to businesses there. They would just stop. They would stop going, right? And so what would that do? Well, the profits of the business would go down. So they're going to go, crap. And they're going to know this. They're going to know if there's a lot of crime. And they're going to be like, what do I need to do? I need to maybe I need to do something. And they're going to figure out something in order to have police or some increased security in the area. Maybe they'll put lights out in the parking lot. Maybe that will help. Maybe they'll put a fence around the area and have a gate that you have to enter in order to come in. Maybe they'll have a security guard that will walk by every now and then. Maybe they'll have cameras. The list would go on, but the cost would be borne on the owner, the landowner. And so yes, it would be imposed upon the customer, a slight increase in prices, but everyone else who doesn't go to that business, everyone else, the millions of, thousands of people who just surround that area, who never shop there, they don't have to pay it. And that's the difference today, is that everyone has to pay it. And then you have this economic interest of merchants to supply police protection, right? So it's going to be in their economic interest to do that, right? But the difference is, in addition to what I just said, is that they're going to want to have pleasant and respectful police. That's just the bottom line. And if they don't, they're going to fire them. There's going to be no unions or anything that can just stop that from happening, unless it was in the contract, I suppose. But the bottom line is that if they react, if the cop who's a security guard is just walking by and just shoots a little kid, they can just fire the guy. Well, they can't do that with police, and they don't do that with police today, right? Well, maybe if it was a kid. But the state has no incentive to be courteous and pleasant. They don't have to have police officers to do that. They don't have to worry about it. Why? Because they have monopoly. They can take our money and they can use it to pay for police, and they don't have to worry about anything. And the police can all be in one neighborhood doing horrible things and be okay in all the other neighborhoods. And guess what? Everyone else is the one who matters, because they're the voting people. They're the people who make, part of the ruling class, really, who decides and imposes these rules on the minority. So again, it goes back to that. Bottom line, the state has no incentive. And this same application here would occur if it was a residential neighborhood or even an apartment complex. Okay, an apartment complex, the landowner has the incentive to produce some sort of protection there. Now, you might think, well, why don't they do that now? Like I live in an apartment, let's say. I don't, but let's say I live in an apartment and it's just not safe. Well, assuming that it's not safe, because generally most apartments are at least as safe as any other place, like maybe anywhere else, you have a lot of problems because the police, they have the monopoly now. They're already paying taxes. You're paying taxes, the property taxes. Your rental is it's included, that you have to pay for this stuff. And so they're taking money. So now they're going to have to charge you extra to pay for more police? No, I think they're just going to take their hit and just maybe not provide as good a service. Why? Because they can. Because you'll blame the government, because that's the monopoly. So take the monopoly out, and then you really could blame the private business and the apartment owner. You couldn't blame police because there wouldn't be a public police. And so what about residential neighborhoods? So we'll continue. Well, the capital value of the land would determine the safety provided. So there's a varying degrees of service. And the character of police protection in a neighborhood would depend on the wishes of landowners. So you have two kind of things that would add to the value, the degrees of service of police. Okay, so for example, if you're living in an area where the value of the homes are $1 million, well, of course you're probably going to have better service. Of course, that's just a natural consequence of that. And if you're in a poorer neighborhood, you may not have as high of a service, whatever that means. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that you would have no service at all. And I'd implore to think of all the examples of the things you have if you've ever been poor, where you can get life insurance just like someone who's rich. It might be a little bit more, but you can get it. You can also get cable. You can get internet service. And what you do is you buy a slower speed, so it's just not as fast, right? Now you can go, oh, well, you're just going to have police who are not as fast. Well, shoot, that's what we have now. But unfortunately, you have to live with all the consequences of them being unpleasant, of them not caring, of them having the monopoly to use violence, and you don't have to, there's nothing you can do. They have these things where they create laws that protect them. And the private market's not going to have that because it's going to be voluntary. And then you can also have your own stuff. You can create your own defense, your own protection of your land, right? And that's really the bottom line. Even today, that's why people don't go into homes. It's because people, I mean, I'm sure there's varying reasons for that. But if there's a potential that someone in that home has a weapon, then maybe if you're a bad guy, you're not going to go in the home. So that's in a way that you could do it more efficiently on a cheaper level that even a poor person could protect themselves in their home. And even with the rich people, they might be paying for a service that's a waste. They might not even be using it because they live in a rich neighborhood. You know, there's degrees of that too. So they're wasting money. So you can always go. And then bottom line is that the character of it, the degrees of the service is going to depend on the wishes of the landowner. They're also going to determine what do you need in your community. It's your homeowners association, your small area, your 3 or 4 homes, your apartment complex that will determine the rules and the service provided. It's not some bureaucrats in some city office that have to follow the wishes of everybody somehow. That's impossible. And what about discriminatory residential sellers? Right? So we have apartment complexes that are discriminate against black people, let's say, or redheads, right? Well, discrimination is choosing favorably or unfavorably in accordance with whatever criteria a person may employ. So, of course, it's not just race. It can be anything. It can be someone with glasses, someone without. It can be someone who's educated, someone who's not, someone who has money, someone who does not have money. Guess what? Discrimination happens all the time, and it has to. There's nothing. And again, you can listen to our interview with Walter Block to see more about that. But the price for discrimination is paid by the owner. So even now, even with government, because government discriminates all the time too, but they don't have to live with the price. There's no price mechanism. You can't go anywhere else. They have the monopoly. But if a owner of a place decided not to rent to couples with young children because he thought he'd lose money because he'd have a less risk of defacing his property, right? So like, let's say if the owner said, you know what, you have kids, I'm not going to let you live here because if you do, I think your kids are going to be bad and they're going to cause damage to my property, right? Or they could go, you know what, I'm not going to rent to redheads. I just don't like them. Well, in whatever example that we pick, they're going to suffer economic losses. Now, of course, with the redheads thing, or with the kids thing, actually, they're probably going to lose more because there's probably more couples with children. So then you'd probably even have residential areas that would actually be just towards people with children. I mean, we have some of that now today. Or maybe towards redheads, I don't know. But so you have these different things, and regardless, discrimination always occurs all the time. And it should in some instances, you know. I don't see why it wouldn't, because again, it happens all the time. And it's up to the owner, whatever they want to do. And the way to handle that is economic losses. So if they're not going to let blacks move into a neighborhood, well, they're going to lose a lot of money, a whole lot of money. And the more discrimination, so the more they keep doing it, the more they jump on well, I don't want blacks, I don't want Jews, I don't want women. Well, shoot, I have less money I could make, less profits. And I'm going to have less willing people and customers who are going to want to move there. So then another argument with roads is, well, we need traffic lights, right? We have to have these traffic lights. And by the way, I put a picture on the YouTube video, and it's a show. It's on Netflix, I think, and it's called Traffic Light, and it's really funny. It's got like the dude. Oh man, I'm getting like a brain fart. But it's got a lot of really good stuff. Really good show. You should watch it. It's really funny. Okay, it's kind of like a Modern Family, sort of, kind of. Okay, so the argument here is that the interest. So we need traffic lights, right? We need to have this uniformity so that people know when to stop. Well, of course, we can have our own discussion on whether traffic lights are the best way to handle roads. Of course, they could actually increase accidents. We don't know. That could be another discussion. But the bottom line is, it's in the interest of all road owners to have uniform rules. Okay, so like let's say there's 3 areas in a county or something, and they kind of have the main road that you drive on to go to work. Okay, well, let's say and there's 3 areas on that road. Well, let's say one of those out of the 3 changes the thing. They change let's say they make you drive on the left side and not the right side. Well, that's going to cause some conflict, okay? You're probably going to have more accidents, and you're going to have less customers because they're going to be like, I can't do this. And so when those 3 people come into an agreement, if they were to like work together to make a main road or do something, they're going to want to make sure they have the same traffic light. And even without the agreement, that person who's on the left side who changes it, he's probably going to want to change it because he wants people to be on his roads because he's going to see that people are not driving on his road. Maybe 3 roads would probably be a bad example, or 3 areas. You probably have to have multiple. But bottom line is that they're going to want to have uniformity. And even if they don't, there would maybe be 1 or 2 different types of changes. And they would be in different areas. So again, it would not make any sense for you to be in a small area like a 10-mile radius, and for all the, every now and then a road is completely different. That would be, they would lose money real fast. So what about the roads? Well, public roads we need the government to at least build the roads, right? Well, what public roads do, they sort of act as a subsidy. It's not only corporate welfare, it's welfare to individuals. It's a subsidy because the people who use it a lot. They have to pay the same as someone who never does. And this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, where if I live here in Jacksonville and I live in, let's say, South Side, okay, and you live in North Side Jacksonville, which is many miles away. I don't ever go over there, let's say. Well, I have to pay for your roads, but that makes no sense because I don't ever drive over there. And then let's assume that you just stay in your house all the time and you have a Publix shopping center that's a mile away that you can just walk to. Well, you have to pay for your road too. Is that right? Why should you have to do that? That doesn't make any sense. And public roads have numerous negative consequences. So Rothbard pointed to the overexpansion of the use of vehicles. So there's a consequence. Now we have thousands of vehicles that are just everywhere. Like, why do we need these vehicles? We have bulldozing of homes, the use of eminent domain, destruction. He didn't mention this specifically, but I love to talk about this when I talk about roads and urban sprawl and all this stuff, is that it's bad for the environment. I mean, we think of the main, and we're going to talk about this, I guess, in the next part, but the state is by far the heaviest polluter. They build these roads. They subsidize this stuff. And it's expansion, and you're destroying trees, and you're destroying wildlife, and you're creating this supply where there's no demand often, because you're hoping that there'll be a demand, and it's just horrible. It's horrible for everyone. And so highways, well, what would they probably do? Well, they would probably charge tolls. And yeah, you'd think, oh, well, that's bad. But again, if you don't use the highway, you don't have to worry about it. Whereas now you have to pay for the highway. It comes to your taxes, your state taxes. It comes to property taxes. You have to pay for this, federal taxes, all this stuff. And so you'd have a price mechanism that would work in the private market because, and he gives an example of, well, let's say it's rush hour, okay, and you're on a toll road. Well, what the company's probably going to do is that during rush hour, because there's so many cars who are coming, they're going to increase prices. Right, we have an increase of demand, so we have to raise prices so it can lower it. And so what's going to happen is you're going to have less people who are going to drive during rush hour. It just makes sense. And it would be really cool. I mean, think about the effects of that is that you'd have these varying work times. So not everyone would be working 8 to 4. And maybe that would be a good thing. I don't know. Or maybe you wouldn't go to work. Maybe you wouldn't have to drive to work if there weren't public roads. Maybe you would work from your home. Maybe you would have a place that would be closer to your home because there's not an agent of the state to use taxpayers' money by stealing money from people and using it to subsidize the use of the building of roads, right? And once congestion would lower, prices would eventually decrease. So let's say in the middle of the night, it's going to be dirt cheap because nobody's driving on it. And they want people to drive on it because they want profits. It's better to have some people than no people. Private parking would cost more on congested streets. And you go, oh, well, man, damn. I think you even hear it today with like New York where they have like $1,000 parking places, but the problem with that though, or like $1 million parking spaces or whatever, the problem, my understanding of that is that it's permanent. So like you buy a parking spot and then you own that parking spot for a month, let's say. Well, that would make sense to be really expensive. And that's where I think Murray Rothbard here he's saying what they would do is they would increase that price. And they would do it, it wouldn't be a full day. It would be by the hour, let's say, or by every 2 hours. And the whole purpose of that is to induce rapid turnover. They could have more customers, more people paying money, and that would make more sense. They would make more money. Instead of having an open space for the 10 days that you're gone, that doesn't make any sense. And so that's a good thing, because now you're going to create a space that more people can park in. So all the people who are screwed because you own this spot, you're rich enough to own the spot, well, now a lot of people can afford it. And so a lot of people can use it. They don't have to worry about parking it somewhere else. And then, of course, having an expensive parking spot would lead to other changes as well. Maybe they create a parking structure or something, or maybe they wouldn't even have that. Maybe you would just work at home. And urban street owners might require anyone driving to buy a license, and maybe different ones for peak hours. Or they'd use TV cameras, or maybe have a meter in the vehicle or something. So you think about, like, if you're in a downtown area and there's a bunch of cars driving on the roads, well, maybe the way they would, maybe they can't do a toll road, but maybe they would have some way that they could kind of fence it in. It's in a fenced-in area, and the only way to get into that land is to go through this one road, or maybe 2 or 3 or 4, and you'd have a license. Or you'd have kind of like the toll roads, kind of how they have it now, where I think we have it in Florida, the Sunway or Sunshine, I don't know what it is. It's more like in Orlando, although we're getting a toll road soon, which sucks. And the reason I say it sucks is because I still have to pay taxes. Like, why? Let me stop paying the taxes. Let me stop paying the gas tax, all this other stuff, and then maybe you can have a toll road, because I'm not going to drive on it. Maybe I'll drive on a different toll road, and I'll pay on that one. I don't care. So chapter 12. So now we're going to talk about police, law, and the courts. And this, I think, is the crux of the minarchist position. And I have a pretty funny meme. It's a picture of Ron Paul, and well, not pretty funny. It's not funny, but it should make you at least smile, I suppose, the nerd in all of us. But it says minarchists, government is bad. So that's what minarchists believe. But so it should only do the really important things, which is police, law, and the courts. That is the most important things. And that's a really clever argument, because that's what you argue. I argue that too. I say, well, government's horrible. They're horrible at the post office, right? They can't just do that. They can't teach. We know that. And so they're horrible at these things because they're a monopoly, because of no competition, because of the lack of price mechanism, because of the subsidy, because of the inherent relationship between government and business, and the force and the violence and everything. But it's okay with the police. It's okay with the courts. It's okay with law. And here we're going to see that maybe it's not okay. And so police protection. Well, with a limited budget, the state must allocate its funds according to politics. Okay, so again, there's a limited amount they can spend. They can't spend willy-nilly, the state at least. And so they have to determine, how are we going to use this funds? What kind of service are we going to provide with police? Well, they're going to do that according to politics. And politics, as often, is not the democracy we live in. I don't know if it's just us or anywhere else, but regardless, you have 51% who are going to tell 49% what to do. And that's not right. In the free market, consumers would pay for whatever degree of protection they wish to purchase. And I kind of talked about this before, so I might not hit this too much. So if you had an officer all the time, let's say, it would be very expensive. And I don't think a lot of people would do that. But every now and then, maybe less. So maybe a business would just have a police officer at night instead of during the day. I mean, think about that. That's a really important distinction. Because right now, we pay for day and night, and it's really expensive. Or maybe if you're a homeowner, maybe you would just have some police come to during the day when you're gone, when you're at work. Or maybe you just have someone who would check by. Or maybe you'll have something like what we have now. So let's just take a few seconds here, a minute maybe, to look at all the private protection that we have now. And think of how efficient it is. Well, we can have block or neighborhood protection. Now that could be good or bad, Trayvon Martin, Zimmerman. But other areas, it's not always so bad. I know in my neighborhood, we have some people, there's just like one person on our street who is just very, very, she looks around, okay? She knows who's on the street. And that's kind of good. I don't need to have security. I always think of that. It's negative because she knows when I'm home and when I'm not. But damn right, if something happens, she'll call me on the phone and say, you know what, there's a car in your driveway, and she's done this. Is it okay? Here's the driver's license. Here's the number of the license plate. Why couldn't you have that? But now I have to pay, and maybe I'll pay her a little bit. Maybe I'll take her some cookies or something. Maybe a gift card. But now we don't have that. We have to pay these people to do that stuff. Now the problem is that even with, and I was thinking about that, and I think I said this earlier, is that why couldn't we have that anyways? But maybe in some instances you just don't want to do that because you're paying taxes already. You're already being, You're being forced to work 3 or 4 months out of the year to pay for stuff you don't really want. And so why should you have to work another 2 months to pay for what you might need in your own neighborhood? Or like, I don't know. But you always have that. I guess I'm talking about other stuff. So you could have private guards, right? Some nicer neighborhoods, even some middle, not so nice neighborhood, even some apartments that are just like lower class, or not lower class, I don't know what that means, but lower incomes or something, lower rents. They have private guards sometimes. So you have that as well. You have insurance companies. You know, if someone breaks into your house and they steal something, maybe you'll be reimbursed for that stolen object. Now, of course, you have to go out and buy the service, but at least it's out there. There's private detectives. You know, we talked about the Pinkerton Agency. Well, it's still around, and it's still a very professional, very successful business. And there's others around too. There's also Veronica Mars. You know, there's great private detectives out there. There's safes, locks. I mean, think about those two things. How much money has that saved? Think about banks. Or, sorry, I don't know why I said banks. Bikes, right? You drive a bike to somewhere, and then you lock it up to a post or something. Well, aside all private property rights there, let's just say, think about the protection that does. If you didn't have that lock, would your bike still be there? Maybe, maybe not. But think about that. You spend $5, $10, maybe $20 for a good lock, and you're done. You've saved all the money. That's your police. Locks, safes, yeah. Closed circuit TVs, burglar alarms. Think of ADT and those type of companies, right? They install these burglar alarms in your house, which are like normal in most new houses. And so if you pay for the service, well, if someone goes into your house, the alarm rings. So one, it notifies everyone, which is itself a private protection, because now other people will maybe investigate, or maybe they'll call you, and then the company's notified, and then they'll call you, or they'll send someone out. That is the private market. They solve it. And the goal of government police. What is the goal of government police? What's the bottom goal? And it's hard because they don't really have a goal, because there's no price mechanism. So really the only thing that they're mostly interested is catching and punishing the criminal. It's in putting these people behind bars for the good of society, right? That's what we hear. But it's not restoring the loot, the thing that was stolen, the thing that was harmed, the thing that was injured. That's not the goal of police. It's never been, it never will be. The idea of restitution is not the goal of police. You know, if something is stolen out of your car, there's very little the police can actually even do to find this stuff, even if it's stolen from your house, unless you had a tracking device. I worked at a store once where they actually sell these things, and this stuff's going to become more popular as we go on. And it's little dots that you just put on your object. So let's say you have a computer, you put a little dot that nobody can really see, or maybe they don't know what it is, and it's a GPS thing, and it tracks it. And you can look on your phone or a computer, and you can see where that computer's at. So not only can the computer have the software, so there's another police protection by the private market, right? Oh man, it's just awesome how the private market's solved a lot of this stuff. And they don't have to use coercion, they don't have to use violence, they don't have to steal money from people. It's all voluntary. And if insurance companies, if it applied to insurance companies and they had to pay benefits to victims of crimes, okay? So if you had insurance that said if someone in your house was shot to death by somebody, that they would pay out, $1 million or something. Well, guess what? The insurance company's probably going to do something. Maybe send a police officer every now and then, maybe do something to lower that cost, because they don't want to take that burden, or lower the risk, sorry. So what happens if there's no protection? What happens if you're supremely poor and there's really nothing you can do? Well, I think I already said a lot of this stuff. Same with neighborhood protection. Again, I gave the example with my neighbor. Even if we were in a poor neighborhood, that doesn't mean that there's not going to be someone who's just crazy like that, right? And helpful. Sorry, that's the better term, right? Or you could have a gun. You could have a weapon. That could be your protection. You could have a lock. Things that are very inexpensive that can protect you. So you'd have to be like supremely poor, which would be deep poverty, which even in the government they can't solve that. Even in socialism, whatever that is, but even in Germany and in Norway and Sweden, where there are poor people, they still can't afford everything. So it's silly to think that people would have absolutely no protection. But let's assume even if they didn't somehow, well, even companies, private businesses, well, they might still intervene, So if they're police or something, they might still help you because they're cultivating goodwill. So maybe maybe they might ask for a voluntary donation afterwards. So it'd be some like emergency help when someone pulls over and helps you, or a private charity could come in and help, or special police aid societies. I mean, think about what we have today that help poor people. We have legal aid. Yeah, it's not provided to every poor person, but it's something, and it's better than nothing. And that's usually, those legal aids are usually for people who are in deep poverty, not just poverty. And so if a policeman saw an emergency and it was happening where he wasn't in charge, he didn't have jurisdiction or something, well, he would help, right? Because it would cultivate goodwill. Like, are you telling me that a business would see someone and say, and just let that happen? I mean, think about the instance in a Lowe's where it happened recently where there was a person in a wheelchair and the wheelchair thing broke or something. And then the Lowe's workers, they helped him build the thing back together. Like, why would they do that? I thought this corporation was evil. Now, maybe the workers got in trouble for doing that, but I highly doubt that because they cultivated goodwill. So now people are going to be like, holy crap, this is a good company. They're really nice. Maybe they do care for people. So, I don't know. And won't the police attack one another? So now we have these, let's say we have neighborhood police agencies or something. Let's say your homeowners association got one, and then another homeowners association had their own police attack, their own police service or something, and they were different ones. Let's just assume, okay? Well, let's even assume that it did happen, okay? Let's say they did attack each other. Let's say they went full-on war with one another. Well, at a minimum, at least we wouldn't have interstate wars. So the worst case scenario is you'd have that neighborhood attacking that neighborhood. But now, when one state, one government, one nation, one country attacks another country or state or whatever you want to call it, guess what? Everyone's in the war. And because it's a state and because it can accumulate capital through taxation and theft, it can buy the nicest things out there. It can buy nuclear bombs, which is horrible, right? It can buy, assault rifles and tanks and airplanes and bombers and things that your probably local police force probably could not afford. That's a good thing, actually. Because now you're not going to bomb them. You're not going to bomb innocent people and mass murder people. So bottom line is only those consumers are going to be at war with the other consumers. But bottom line is it wouldn't make sense to have that at all. Because it costs money. It's expensive. And because you're in a voluntary contract, you're going to opt out of that contract. You're going to say, I don't want to pay for this shit. It's bad. It's too expensive. I don't agree with this stuff. But you can't do that with government. I can't cancel a contract. How much would you like to cancel your contract with your government, your local government, your federal government, state government? You can't. But you can voluntarily. And it's bad for business. It's not going to look good. Who's going to want to hire you if your employees keep going attacking people willy-nilly, starting wars? And then you'd have private courts that could solve it as well, which we'll talk about. So the courts. Let's talk about that. So the judge decides A is in the wrong, okay? So Alfred or whatever. We'll just call him A, okay? He did something bad. He aggressed against B, okay? If A accepts it and he says, and the judge decides it, says he's guilty, A would go, okay, you know what? I did do it. Well, then you have no problem. No problem. It's easy, right? So even in a private world, if you had private markets and private courts, that would be solved, right? But what if he does not? And remember, let's just go down with this again, especially when it comes to civil court, is that oftentimes you don't even need a court to intervene in situations. Think about all the breach of contracts that you have faced in your life, whether it's valid or not. Maybe you bought something, and I'm doing breach of contract in a very broad view. It could be a breach of express warranty or something like that too. So like, let's say you bought, cereal, and it said that it's no sugar added or something, or 100% natural, and you discover that it's only 90% natural. Oh, you're mad. Well, you only paid $4, $3 for it. Are you really going to go into court and sue them? Are you really going to pay an agency to a lawyer to sue somebody? No. So it happens all the time. It's only the very, very few percentage of people where there's something serious, and that's when you sue. So the current court problems, right? So this is what we have currently with our court system. So we're going to go back to that example. What if he does not decide? Okay, but I just want to, before we get into that, let's talk about some of the current court problems, because we have to compare it. If we're looking at anarchism, or we're looking at the idea of having a private police force or court system, we have to look at what we have today through government. Now remember, government's a monopoly. They don't have the price mechanism. They don't have competition. So the judges are democratically elected, or they're chosen by some bureaucrat who was democratically elected. So, of course, you already have problems automatically from that. And moreover, the judges aren't selected for their wisdom or efficiency, not because they're wise like King Solomon. They're chosen because they're the only people who ran for office. They're the only people who might fit the position or who applied. Or maybe it's someone that the guy knows who's going to appoint him to the court, right? So the courts are monopolies. And so if it's corrupt, if there's a problem, there's nothing you can do about it. And in fact, a lot of these judges, and most if all, they serve lifetime appointments, right? Think about the Supreme Court. There's nothing you can do if you disagree or if they get corrupted by big businesses. But in a free market, there would be many judges. I mean, and I would think that would be true, definitely. It would be like insurance companies. It'd be, you choose. This judge has a really good track record. We're going to go to that judge. And of course, it's going to be like natural. There's going to be a lot of good judges. There's going to be a few great ones and a few bad ones. But guess what? You have that everywhere. But the difference now is that's not even applicable because the government's a monopoly and because they control this stuff through violence and force. And who would pay for the courts? That's a good question to ask, right? Well, each individual, and these are just offerings that Murray Rothbard discusses, as well, each individual could subscribe to a court service and pay monthly. So it'd just be like another monthly bill that you'd pay, I don't know, $20 a month. So that if something did happen, that they would probably apply a lawyer. Provide a lawyer, sorry. They'd provide you assistance. They'd provide you help. They'd try to resolve the conflict without any serious court costs or anything like that. And if not, then they would, spend the money to, it'd be like insurance. It'd be like some sort of subscription service that you'd pay for. You do it for Pandora, right? I don't see why it couldn't work for that. Or Netflix or something. Or there could be an individual pay fee whenever he uses the court, with the violator paying eventually. So maybe it'd be like a user fee, just like anything, any service. If I take my kid to the jump house that they have around here in town, the bounce houses things that you pay like $10 to get in, well, that's my user fee. And everyone else doesn't have to pay. Whereas now everyone has to pay and live with the consequences. But it's only me, and it's only when I want to use that service, just like it would be with this. Or they could be hired by police agencies. So these police agencies that you're already paying for, maybe they would subcontract, contract it out to a court system, and they would handle the disputes. Or maybe there'd be a police and court that would be one agency, and that's what you would pay for it. Your homeowners association or your area or you as a landowner would pay for. Well, we have arbitration, so that's probably the best example of private courts today. And it generally works okay, although I think there are some valid, criticisms that you could have. But a lot of that, I think, is the foundation of the system, of the coercive use. Because the bottom line is that even if the arbitration doesn't go through, when it goes into the court system, the government court system, it's often viewed as the correct decision, right? So that's its own problem, okay? But that's a separate problem. But bottom line is that arbitration at least proves that it could work, that it's possible. And so what if merchants refuse to submit to these arbitration things? Well, the other merchants, so we're talking about merchants because that's really the biggest part here. So like, let's say you're buying $10 million worth of iPads, from a company, from Apple or something, well, and they don't send it. That's usually when you would do arbitration. That's usually when you'd go to the court, right? If your neighbor gives you $10 and, if there's something like that, well, then of course you're not going to go to court over $10 or maybe even $100 or $200. And so what would happen if the merchant refused to submit? Well, other merchants could tell others. And so those people might not want to trade with those people, or they could refuse to deal with that person. And so, yeah, maybe you lose out on that initial problem, but man, it's going to suck for that person later on, that merchant later on. Or maybe you'd have a credit rating system, which again, I think currently has its own problems, which is backed by other, I'll probably do an episode one day about credit agencies, but they could be a solution as well. So what about crime? Because crime's a little bit more difficult, right? Because ostracism and then kind of saying, or boycotting, that's not going to work. But though there could be landowners who could refuse access. So let's say I'm Walmart and I have a guy who keeps stealing my stuff. Well, I mean, instead of, putting him in jail, what I'll do is maybe I'll have my security guards or a camera or something, and one security guard watching a bunch of cameras, and they're going to know this guy's face stone cold, and they're not going to let him in. So that's a solution, right? Because again, not everyone's a thief. Let's remember this. This is the key to all this stuff. Not everyone is bad. Even on the normal distribution curve, and let's say it was 5% of people who are really bad. Well, if there's 100 million people, that means there's 5 million people who are bad, and they're spread out all over the place. So it's not like it's not everybody. Like, don't make the media help you think that everyone's evil. And at least everyone would be liable. So even those people who would put people in jail, or I don't know, arrest, maybe probably wouldn't be jails, but maybe arrest people or force them out of the building or something, well, at least they'd be liable. There'd be some sort of, if you had let's say you were innocent is what I'm saying, right? And you walked into the business and you didn't do anything, but they arrested you and you got hurt. Well, you could at least sue them, but now you can't. It's not going to happen because there's immunity and other things. So then there's an appellate process, right? Well, every court would agree to abide by appeals trials. So you have to have some sort of appellate process because you can't just trust one court system to be the only final say. And so now there's only one appellate court regardless of the wishes of either the plaintiff or the defendant. So either person who wants to sue, there's only one appellate court. It goes right to the Supreme Court and that's it. Well, in a free market, you could go to any of them. So even without the Supreme Court, and you're talking about circuit courts, there's still only one circuit court that you can go to. But in the free market, you could go to any appeals judge, and you could do it voluntarily. Maybe within your contract, it would determine, with the merchant contract, it would determine where you could go for appeals. And so at least people would have knowledge of where it's going to go, and you could pick. And there'd be tons of judges, not just 1, 2, or 3. And it'd most likely be paid by the various original courts who would add the charge to premiums or fees. So you're already going through that court, you have some sort of subscription or something with them. Maybe they would charge you an extra $1 for an appellate process, so that if you did appeal, that they would be able to pay for it. And so let's do an example. Well, let's say there's a judge and decides that A is in the wrong, that he's aggressed against B. Remember, we talked about this in the beginning. So A accepts, there's no problem, easy. But what if A does not? Okay, A's the bad guy, B's the good guy. Well, if it was in the same court, okay, so we had the same court. They both had a contract, and it both said that they would go to the same court. Well, if it was guilty, the court would employ force to seize A and exact a punishment with focus on restitution. So again, there's the difference there, is that whatever the punishment's going to be, it's not going to be jail, because that doesn't make sense. It's too cost. I mean, think about jails today. They cost $30,000 a year to put one person in jail. Even in private market, somehow that was cheaper. It'd probably be like 20 or 25 grand, which is still way too much. And it doesn't make any sense. It's not doing anything productive. They'd much rather have the guy work and do something, continue his job wherever he is, and then be forced to pay restitution, right? Now, if they were different courts, you're going to have a problem, right? If B goes to a different court, and this is the guy, the victim, right? And he pleads his case, and he goes to another court, and he pleads his case in his court. And then A takes it to another court, right? And let's say if A is guilty, so if A is even found guilty in his court, well, then still we have no problem. But what if A is not guilty? If he's found guilty, but then what if he was found not guilty? So he's found innocent by his court, okay? So let's make this clear. So in B's court, A is found guilty. In A's court, A is found not guilty. Okay, because he's going to want to hire, maybe he wants to go to a court that always is going to work in his favor because he's a bad guy. He's a professional thief. Well, you'd still have an appellate process. So these two courts would agree, maybe all these court systems would have agreements with themselves that if there was ever an appellate process, and maybe this wouldn't even involve the main consumer on the bottom level, although they would have knowledge, that it would go to a certain appellate court. This is just one solution of many, right? And so it'd go to that court, and then that court would determine. Now, I guess the question is then, could A continue to appeal forever? Could he just keep appealing and say, oh, I want to go to this court, this court, this court, this court? Well, assuming the contract didn't say anything, let's say. Well, nothing's forever, right? It's going to cost money for A. He's going to eventually stop. And maybe courts won't even want to hear him because he's a truly bad guy. I don't know. And it seems sensible to declare then that a decision arrived by any two courts shall be binding. So that's what Murray Rothbard says. He basically says that at the point where there's two courts, this is the most efficient because, of course, the private market's going to try to be, they're going to try to cut costs and try to make things the most efficient. So it seems to make the most sense that any decision made by two courts in this whole process, so the bottom court, that first initial court, and then the appellate court, the first appellate court, that will determine what the decision will be. But that's only if they agree. So it's really the highest, what he's saying is that the highest number of courts that would listen to it is 3, right? Because there'd have to be, like you'd have one that would say yes, one guilty, one not guilty, third guilty, right? And so you'd have 2 courts that would agree on something. So would there be laws? Well, a legal code, and this is what Murray Rothbard says, a legal code is necessary to lay down precise guidelines for private courts. So private courts are going to have some sort of laws in order to understand what to do. And of course, what Murray is asking for is to insist that these laws are going to be based on libertarian principles of no aggression. And they're going to define property rights. They're going to make it clear. They're going to set up rules of evidence. They're going to set up the code of maximum punishment for crimes. They're going to do all this stuff. And the courts are going to compete for the most efficient procedures. And the market, the private consumers, the individuals, would decide whether judges, juries are most efficient. So while I might not agree with everything he's saying with all this stuff, the bottom line is that at least there's competition, okay? So regardless of what you think, whether these laws would be good or bad, because my bottom line is that we're all human, and even private individuals are human. Private businesses are human, and so they're not going to be perfect. They're going to make mistakes. But what's so great about the private market is at least there's competition. Okay, and people are always going to work to make profit. So in order to make profit, you're going to need consumers. And so you're going to do the thing what they want. Generally, you're always going to have the few who's not. But with government, you have no option. You do not have that option. There's no price magnet. The only thing you can do is every 4 years go to a ballot and vote. And that's it. And hope. Even though your people aren't even, whoever you'd support's not even going to be on the ballot in the beginning, which has its own problems. And so what Murray says is there's going to be common law traditions, which I would think this is true because in the sense that there are these laws, and this is what common law is, there's these type of laws that are kind of inherent in nature, that me killing somebody is bad. And so that would be a natural law that would probably be, every court would have something like that. So the good thing is that with common law, it's generally agreed upon principles that I think everyone would agree on. And so there are going to be these foundational laws that are based generally on the non-aggression principle, right? And the imposed, one of the things is that the imposed personal views of judges are going to be kept to a minimum. Okay, so it's not like judges could continue to say, I'm against abortion, so I'm going to rule against you in this case, right? That can happen now with government. That could happen. They might not say that directly. They might say something else, but they can do that because, again, they don't have to worry about competition. And in the private market, like let's say they did have the personal views, well, they could only make decisions when private citizens brought case forward, so when there's an actual case, when the decisions are applied only to the particular case, and the decisions of common law judges are always considered precedent. Now, I'm writing these and telling you because that's what was in the book. I don't agree with any of this because a lot of this stuff, like the first 2 I just said, that's standing. And you need legal standing in order to go to court today in the government. And what the courts do is they just define legal standing however the way they want. So it's not, again, it goes back to that thing is that judges are human. They're going to do the same thing. The only difference, well, there's a lot of other differences too, but it's a monopoly with government. There's no competition. There's no other choices. In a market, you'd have, if I had 10 different judges, well, then they'd eventually try to figure out what the rule would be. Just like with cars and just like with computers. Why do you need rules to make computers? They somehow figure this stuff out. They know what we need and what we want. They cut costs by producing what we need. It's magical. And if they can do it for that, why can't they do it for a court system? And so what if court biases occurred? Well, libertarian does not assume that the lion will lie down with the lamb. That's what he said. Instead, men will be the most moral and most efficient. So that's what I was getting at, right? We're always going to be efficient. You're going to be that private price mechanism that's always going to be there. And any favoritism is going to be highly unlikely. So the life of the court, whether it's going to be successful and make profits continually, which is always what they want to do. They don't want money just the first year. They want it forever. It's going to depend on reputation, integrity, and objectivity. They're going to have some sort of brand name, right? This is the place to go for the ethical people, the ethical judges, just like the Pinkerton Agency. That's why they had the Code of Ethics before even the public courts, public police had it. And businesses earn their keep from a mass market of consumers, not from a few rich people. They earn it from, they want more people to consume it, not a few people. And so the problem is if they risked helping a wealthy client, like let's say they favorited that person, well, then they would lose that mass market. But even now, they don't have that option because there's no competition. If a rich person has an influence with a judge because they're friends and they hang out every now and then, play golf, there's nothing you can do about it. You can hope that through appellate process, maybe they'd say that the judge is impartial, but what if they're in favor of the business person as well? But what about our system of checks and balances, right? So we have this thing called checks and balances, right? The founders, they created this thing. We have three parts of government. You know, the executive, the legislative, the court, and they're supposed to check each other. Well, it's a myth. I mean, look at it. Just look at the history. Look at what's happening. Listen to all our episodes. There's our checks and balances in play. And each institution, and here's the problem with it and why it's such out of whack, is that each institution is a coercive monopoly in its area. And it's part of one government, right? So the court system, it's monopoly. So it's the only place you can go to. And it's part of government. Who pays its checks? Who pays its bills? The government. Who initiated these judges? Who appointed them? The government. Who tells them the law, the constitution that they have to abide by? The government. And the same thing can be applied to all three branches. In a private market, if you'd have something, a problem or something, well, you just go to another judge. That's real active checks and balances. That's what we have today in everything that we do. I don't like the cheeseburger I ate at McDonald's. I go to Burger King. I can't imagine I would do that, but that's the checks and balances. And they would feel it in their purses, in their profits, and they would change something, or they'd go out of business. So the question then is, won't private police become like mobs? And we've talked about this before. Well, in contrast to government, there would be other police forces to combat the outlaw. So there's competition. So you'd have police that could police police. We don't have that today. And oh yeah, we do. But they're government. How can a government act as a check and balance against a government agency? That makes no sense. There's no way they can be impartial. It's impossible. Or maybe there could be. I'll give some reasonableness here. Is that maybe there could be one worker, one or two or three, who could be impartial, but the majority, the ultra majority, are not, because that's where they get paid, and because again they don't have the price mechanism and monopoly, blah blah blah, right? The governments have legitimacy. Here's another difference too, is that governments have legitimacy. That's one of the more important things. When we look at government, and they can do all these horrible things. They can put people in jail. They can kill people who are in jail. That just rape somebody or something like that. Which, yes, it's horrible, but to kill someone, they can commit mass murder by bombing places without our consent, even with our consent. What? But a bandit gang, like some private police agency who did that, they wouldn't be legitimized. Everyone would despise them and hate them. They'd be like the Comcast. You know, imagine the worst company that's out there. I can't even think of one. And if nobody liked it, well, they would have illegitimate. They'd be illegitimate. People would stop going to them. Public would resist. They'd do something. National defense. Well, wars result from conflicts between nation states, each armed to the teeth, each suspicious of attack by another. A libertarian state would not be a threat to anyone. They're dedicated to non-aggression. They're not going to attack anyone. But between nation states, again, are democratically elected, or maybe there's a leader who decides himself what to do. Well, regardless, you have one person, you have one agency, one government who's going to determine that we're going to go to battle. All 300 million of us are going to fight you or live with the consequences of this stuff. You don't have to worry about that in a libertarian society. And we talked about that before too. A nation state is able to identify all of its subjects with itself. I'm an American. You know, this is the United States. Everyone who lives in here is an American. Bam. So Americans are at war. United States goes at war, Americans are at war. That's just how we're. Israel, Hamas, same thing. And it's just depressing because it's mass murder. If a private police agency attacked Mexico, let's say it was on the border of Texas and it attacked Mexico, and let's say it was the Pinkerton Agency or something, right? It was one of the many police agencies in the area. Well, the Mexican government, they wouldn't start attacking all the private police forces. They wouldn't go to war with the whole place. They would just attack the Pinkerton Agency or that private police force. Think how efficient that is and how much money that saves and how many lives it saves, right? And you don't have to live with the consequences when you don't agree with it or don't live in the area. And others within the state would attack. We don't want that to happen. If I live near that area and I have a different police agency, I don't want them to be doing that. So maybe my police agency will attack them. I don't know. Or maybe not even attack. Maybe that's the wrong word. Maybe they would have diplomatic discussions. I don't know. If there's no governments, then any problems would be local police problems. That's the bottom line. And Israel, Hamas, perfect example. It'd all be local. Now, I could see a conflict possibly if it's a city versus city, and you had a really high population like New York City, and if like Newark, or I don't know, what's a big New Jersey city that's right there, and they're really close by and they're attacking each other, right? So maybe there'd be something there. But again, I think the private market would have definitely better solutions than what we have today. And even if one person fired it, it would still make sense for everybody in that community to figure out who fired that thing, because they don't want people to attack them, right? And there's no nation state, so there's no credibility there. So that's kind of the difference between, if you're thinking about Hamas and Israel, is that Hamas, well, they can still blame Hamas because they have credibility because people elected Hamas to be in charge. And it gives, so. And then the question, this was written in 1973, so Murray's asking, what if Russia invades the United States? Well, the main reason a conquering country can rule a defeated country is that the latter has an existing state apparatus to transmit and enforce the victor's orders onto a subject population. You would not have to worry about this in libertarian society. And this is a really important one when you're talking about invasion and taking over a country. And you can see it in Syria today, or in Iraq too with ISIS, is that one of the things that helps ISIS go over and just conquer these areas is because there's already a state apparatus. There's already taxes, right? They have these systems in government already in place. So once they come in, all they have to do is take over those places, and then they reap all the benefits of that stuff. They reap all the taxes, all that revenue comes right into them. It's easy. I mean, it's super easy. But if they didn't have that system, how difficult? I mean, it'd be supremely difficult to just come in there and set up a system all by itself. I mean, it's not easy to form a government. That's why it happens so very few times. But you wouldn't have to worry about that in libertarian society. Moreover, you'd have this magical thing called guerrilla warfare, which is one of the most efficient and healthy wars, I suppose. Like if you have to have a war, guerrilla warfare would make sense. And what that is, and this is what Murray says, and what that is that you'd have one person attacking, basically, like let's say we had the city example again, where New York kind of attacked us. Well, New York attacked in Newark. And Newark, the people there, not everyone's going to fight, of course, but let's say there were freedom fighters, let's say, okay? They wouldn't just shoot willy-nilly if New Yorkers' army came in and invaded, right? They would only shoot the people who were invading. Like, let's say, I'm trying to make it say, let's say trade would always continue, right? And there'd be people, even in the midst of war, there'd be people from Newark going into New York and New York going to Newark, right? But the people, the freedom fighters in Newark wouldn't be attacking the New Yorkers coming in unless they were going to invade and kill people. So they can do that. They can decide. They can discriminate. Here's some good discrimination. Whereas the government can't. They're going to just fire missiles and bombs and just kill everybody. Okay? So what are some of the themes of this episode? So we're pretty much done here. Well, government has the monopoly to create conflict. Right? They have, and that's one of the, I think really the theme is that monopoly is bad, especially when it's coercive and when it's attached to violence. And what you're going to have regardless is you're going to have conflict, and you're going to have inefficiency, and you're going to have people getting screwed and people having the money stolen from them and all this other stuff. You're going to have inefficient service, people who aren't happy. And that's because of the monopoly. And also because there's no price mechanism. There's nowhere to know the profits and losses. The only price mechanism is voting. And clearly that doesn't work. And that didn't work 100 years ago. It didn't happen, but it didn't work before Citizens United. It didn't work 200 years ago, and it doesn't work today. And then the better question, I think the theme of his book really, especially this chapter, is the alternative any better? So is what we have today any better than what could be with an anarchist rule, let's say, with no state, or with private courts, with private police, with private roads? Do you really think what we have today is better than those alternatives? That's really the question that I would implore for you to answer as best you can until you hear part 6 and forever. But thank you for listening. Make sure you check out Critical Thinking is Required, and make sure you check out all the other parts. And part 6 will be out shortly. And thank you again.